So this is a talk I gave in February of 2016 at Spackenkill Middle School for their STEM day. This is on modeling for medicine, 3D printing in the hospital. So this is a talk about medical modeling and how we can use 3D printing to improve patient care. So a joke I made with the students there, since we've got a bunch of 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, is that I'm a PhD candidate, which means that I'm in 17th grade. And actually now I'm in 18th grade, I think, by this count. But anyway, let's go into it. So, what are some professions where people practice to hone their skills? We've got musicians, athletes, even actors. They all practice. But what about physicians? How do physicians practice their surgery? So there's, the reviews of anatomy in textbooks through illustrations and memorizations and things like that that refresh us with how the body is laid out. And we even have things like physical models and cadavers to provide reference. And now there's VR and AR tools that are taking this to the next step. But one thing in common with all of these is that they're generic models, and a brain like this, a generic healthy brain, is not the same thing as the brain of a person who's actually going to come in and see a doctor who has some kind of specific medical condition. So these two things aren't really the same, and training on this doesn't prepare you for training on a brain that has a disease. True for any other part of the body as well. So the practice models don't represent the disease, and every disease is different, which is just a whole other caveat. So this brings us to medical modeling, which is the application of three-dimensional renderings and printings of patient-specific anatomy, so parts of the body that are unique to individual patients. Now, these are just some examples of different models that have been 3D printed from different facilities, including our own. So real quick, 3D printing is also called additive manufacturing, and it's building 3D models layer by layer. So you can do this with plastics, you can do this with liquid resins, and you can do this with powders. These are kind of the three main branches of 3D printing. And they all work in different ways. So these filaments are squeezed out of a hot nozzle, kind of like a hot glue gun, and each layer is put down on top of the other, and the hot plastic cools off and fuses to the layers of plastic beneath it. And you can also do all these cool little, semi-hollow patterns on the inside. So you can see that with this rectilinear and hexagonal infill, different shapes of how we can layer plastic inside the model. The resin printing uses light, usually it's UV light, to initiate a chemical reaction that changes a liquid to a solid. And there's three different major ways that this is done, but essentially it's all the same kind of layering process, except instead of letting a material heat and cool, we're doing a chemical reaction to turn it into a solid, and that's how each layer fuses to the layer before it. Lastly, we have the powders, where powder is rolled out in a very thin sheet over a build area, almost like a piece of paper, and then either a laser is used to heat up and melt the powder, fusing it together in very specific regions, or you can use an inkjet, kind of like a printer, except instead of printing just colored ink, you're printing glue that actually glues the powder together. So these are the two ways that we use powder printers. And when we're printing medical models, we're taking a picture of the patient's anatomy. It's an exact replica down to the size of organs and structures inside the person's body. And you can modify the models to highlight specific features more than the body even can on its own. So you can get different colors or different textures or things, and you have different capabilities for different printers. So when we make a model, you usually start with a scan, and that can be an X-ray or a CT or an MRI or an ultrasound or a PET image. All these different kinds of medical scanners, they produce 2D and 3D information. And you would use a different scan for different body parts. So MRI can't see bones, but the CT doesn't see the brain very well. So you can kind of combine different things together to get your final results. After we have our scans, we do segmentation, and this is selecting regions of interest in the scan. So in this case, we have this tumor region, and it's either automatically by a computer or manually by a doctor. So they go around and actually highlight the parts that they want to see represented in a 3D model. And you do this either automatically, manually, or semi-automatic with the assistance of a computer. Once you have a bunch of segmentations from each stack of the image, you can, you put them on top of one another, and you get this kind of 3D structure as a result. So this is kind of an example of 2 slices, and then the 3D models that have been segmented from within that. So you have some blood vessels and some bones in this case. Once you've got your model, you have to prepare the print. So there's usually some things you have to do to clean up the scan and highlight features in the final model. If you want a tumor to show up green against white bone and red blood vessels, you can do that in software that prepares the model for 3D printing. And then you have to actually pick the printer you're going to use, and that's based on different considerations about what things you need to highlight and what performance you need from the model. And then finally, you 3D print it. So here's some examples of medical modeling. This first image is a patient's brain vasculature, and somewhere in there is an aneurysm. And normally you need a whole bunch of different aneurysm clips in the operating room to go in and treat that so that it doesn't run the risk of rupturing. By printing out a patient's brain vasculature in advance, you can actually before ever going into the operating room and operating on the patient, pick out some of the clips you're going to use. So instead of going in with 50, you go in with like 4 or 5, and it takes much less time to actually do the surgery. Another example is this model of a patient who was going to have a skull surgery, and if you notice under their chin, there's this vessel that comes and kind of goes down the center of the neck. That's the carotid artery, which is kind of important. And the original surgical procedure was going to go straight through under the jaw in that neck region to do the surgery, and it turns out that they had to change their plan, because if they had gone in that way without seeing the model, they ran the risk of hitting the carotid artery and killing the patient. So this was very important for guiding the approach for the surgeons. And then lastly, this is an example of a heart born with a defect, where 2 of the chambers that are not supposed to be linked up are linked up, and blood is moving in the wrong direction. So this is a fairly common neonatal disease, something that occurs in newborn children, and it is easy to fix, but you need to be able to plan out how you're actually going to patch things up so that blood moves the right way. So by printing out a model of the heart, you can go and test out different approaches and see which one will give you the best flow when you're done with the surgery. So this is just another example. I like it because it's the colors of Mount Sinai, but this is showing you a pretty complex model of a liver with different blood vessels in it, and you can really get a pretty good 3D image of the entire organ. So there you go. That's medical modeling for 3D printing, and I hope everybody enjoyed it.